Okay, this is the last section of the sex offenders lecture, just a couple slides here, but it was kind of different in topic, and to make things easy to find on YouTube, I decided to separate it out. So we're going to talk about special topics or special populations of sex offenders, and this has become increasingly emphasized in recent research. These are hot up-and-coming areas. We're going to start with a spotlight on another Canadian researcher, Dr. Michael Seto, is becoming incredibly well known, is incredibly well known in the sex offender research literature. His research focuses on pedophilia and on internet sex offenders. So I'm going to focus a little bit on internet sex offenders. He's done a lot of really interesting consultation work with places like Facebook and the Vatican to help talk about ways to kind of reduce or prevent sexual abuse of children, and preventing sexual abuse within the clergy, or people targeting people online for underage people online for sex offenses. So he's done lots of neat stuff. He is the only person I know who has a selfie with the Pope. So Michael Seto has published a couple books, but we're going to talk about internet sex offenders, as that's a particularly unique area. And as a reminder, you guys are probably young enough that still the internet feels to you like it always existed. But it is important to remember, and especially in the sex offender field, that research, particularly follow-up research looking at sex offenders who reoffend, often have 5 or 10 years follow-up. So and then it takes a long time to collect the data, code the data, run analyses, this, that, and the other. So if there's a study that comes out now with a 10-year follow-up of sex offenders, those sex offenders were probably released in the 1990s. So it really does take a long time for research to catch up. And so it really only has been in the last 5 to 10 years that we're starting to look at internet sex offenders. And we've been very slow on that, and not a lot of good follow-up studies on recidivism. Things to just highlight how old I am. Your trivia for the day: when I started university, Facebook hadn't even been invented yet. And now it's considered uncool and only for old people. So things really have changed. And so some statistics from Michael Seto's book. Toronto in particular, he has a lot of data from. That's where he's done a lot of work. He lives in Kingston now. He worked for many years at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health. You might remember CAMH from the lecture on substance abuse. They produce every 2 years that fabulous surveys of high school students looking at their substance use behavior. So at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health, they get a lot of referrals for assessments for people in the criminal justice system. And they were noting already that by 2005, over 15% of the cases referred to them were cases of child pornography looking, at online. Whereas prior to that, and even, at 2005, all of the research on, virtually 100% of the research on sex offenders was looking at samples that would have had no child pornography cases, or hardly any, like maybe at most 0.5% of the offenders in the sample. So the availability of the internet, online child pornography offenses, really exploded in prevalence and in our ability to actually catch and charge them. And they consistently they started to become a very sizable proportion of most sex offender populations. And almost all of the research, all of the meta-analyses that were originally conducted by Carl Hansen just don't speak to this population. So there's a lot of interest in the field of whether, basically decades of research that we have on sex offenders, does that actually apply to child pornography offenders online, or are they a different type of offender? And so Michael Seto, along with Kelly Babshishin and Carl Hansen, have conducted some meta-analyses on this. Kelly Babshishin was the first author of them. And generally what we're finding so far in terms of characteristics is, compared to other types of sex offenders, are traditional sex offenders. Internet sex offenders tend to have higher levels of sexual deviance, so they're more likely to be sexually interested in children, but they have lower general antisociality. So all those factors that you see among criminals in general, they have lower rates of those. And there's an important distinction between online only and mixed online offline offenders. So sex offenders who commit sex offenses on the internet as well as in real life contact sex offenses are the highest risk, whereas those who commit sex offenses only online tend to be the lowest risk offenders. And so far the data is suggesting that internet sex offenders are the lowest risk to reoffend compared to other types of sex offenses. And another question that people often want to know is, are they, essentially, if someone's looking at child pornography online, for example, is it inevitable that they're going to commit a sex offense against a child, or they already are, and they're just, in addition, they're also looking at child porn online. And so looking at samples of internet sex offenders, about 1 in 8 have an official criminal record for a contact sex offense. There have been a few studies that have been able to use anonymous self-report data, so offenders can disclose if they've committed a contact sex offense without legal repercussions to themselves. And in those surveys, half of them report that they have committed a contact offense. So clearly there's a bunch that haven't been caught for it, but they have committed a contact sex offense. On the other hand, though, glass half full, what that also means is that roughly half of internet sex offenders are not committing contact sex offenses. So there is a huge chunk that are online offenders only. I'm also going to talk about female sex offenders. This is an area, sex offender research in particular, I could have done so many other spotlights on Canadian researchers. Franca Cortoni is the kind of most well-known expert on female sex offenders. She's at the University of Montreal. And so female sex offenders are smaller in proportion. There's actually a new meta-analysis came out with Franca Cortoni and with Kelly Babshishan. And it suggests that it varies depending on where you look, but roughly somewhere in the criminal justice system, roughly about 3% of sex offenders in the criminal justice system are female. So very, very few females relative to males get charged or convicted of sex offenses. But there's some idea that people have these stereotypes that women don't commit sex offenses and they're less likely to charge them. There's particularly a very harmful stereotype that if a male teacher has sex with a female student, that's predatory and, sex offender. But if a female teacher has sex with a male student, that's, awesome for the male student and he's lucky, as opposed to recognizing that that is sexual abuse of a minor and should be treated in the same way. So there is some idea that maybe female sex offenders are even less likely than male sex offenders to get caught or charged. From victimization surveys, the same meta-analysis by Franca Cortoni and Kelly Babshishan found that if you ask people in victimization surveys who's been sexually victimized, roughly 10 to 11% of them say that their abuser was a female. So there is a suggestion that they're underrepresented in the criminal justice system, but even so, that's suggesting from victimization data that 90% of sex offenders out there are male. And so there's similar to internet sex offenders, there's a lot of questions in the field of, are female sex offenders similar to male offenders? Should we use the same methods of assessment and treatment and management, or do we need to throw out the book and do completely new research to understand female sex offenders? And the research is suggesting so far that female sex offenders are uniquely different than male sex offenders. They are much less likely to sexually reoffend, and there's data suggesting that the risk factors for onset and recidivism among female sex offenders might be meaningfully different than male sex offenders. So there might be different causal risk factors. And one key example that I'm going to highlight is that the vast majority of male sex offenses commit their offense by themselves. However, some research is suggesting it varies, but some research is suggesting roughly half of female sex offenders commit their sex offense with another perpetrator, typically a male partner, a boyfriend or a husband. So they tend to get involved with a male, and it's in that combination of being involved with a male that they commit sex offenses against children. So it may be sometimes you might see this in a man marries a woman and convinces her to let him sexually abuse her children, or even convinces her to participate in the abuse. And in these situations, the women vary in how active and involved they are in the abuse, but that's a much more common scenario that we really don't see with male sex offenders. So so the research suggesting female sex offenders are quite different. That in a nutshell then is the last of this lecture, and this also makes it the last lecture of this course. I want to take a moment again and thank you guys for your patience as we converted everything online. I know that this has been a stressful semester for all of you. I know this isn't what you've signed up for, but But I am proud of you for getting through this, and I'm wishing you guys all the best as you study for the final exam. And email myself or your TA, Susanna, if you have any questions. Take care. Bye.